everyone to the final session of a long day, and I think, but I'm not entirely sure, that this is the 24th postgraduate symposium, annual symposium with Oxford, APGRD and Royal Holloway's theatre department. And in so many ways, at the end of a fantastic day, when first day, we've got another day tomorrow at Royal Holloway, first day in Oxford, when we've thought about voice, bodies, we've watched people embodying multiple roles, some people with no rehearsal time whatsoever in a wonderful immersive workshop. And we've just had a fantastic response from Sarah Cullinan-Heron, which has, I think, summed up so beautifully and wonderfully intelligently the great papers that we've heard today. When last year, after the second day at Royal Holloway, we had our traditional kind of plenary and then glass of whatever is our choice, or whatever Royal Holloway can come up with. We always traditionally think about themes, and voice and the body were very much, the sort of top choice. And very quickly, I knew who we should be inviting for our guest lecture. And even better, because I think when we first met, when I first met our guest speaker, he was doing his doctorate in Royal Holloway. Today, we're going to hear a fantastic lecture, I know for sure, by someone who I think is thinking more seriously and more ambitiously about what voices in performance, in theatre, in site-specific spaces can do. Our guest speaker is Konstantinos Thomaidis, who is, and I find it very interesting because he's associate professor. Normally people just say in the theatre department, but he is associate professor in voice, theatre and performance at the University of Exeter. And that is, for me, very interesting because he is, yes, a serious academic who's written the book, which I did mention this morning, I'm going to mention again, in the Theatre and series, it's Theatre and Voice. And when Konstantinos said to me, would you like to read it some time ago? And I thought, am I going to understand this? I don't know about voice theory and so on. It is a brilliant book, unbelievably readable and incredibly erudite at the same time. He is an actor, a director, a musician, and also a movement director, which I find very interesting. Let's say he does a lot of site-specific work. And I don't think I'll say any more about the work because I think that's going to become apparent today as he gives a talk called Voicing Unacoustics, like you, I'm interested in a recent production of Sophocles, Ichneutai. Over to you, Konstantinos.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introductions. Thank you, I'll suffice that. This is a project that has been sort of living with me for about 5 years, 3 years of practical research. I spent a year up in the mountains in Dodoni with workshop participants discovering the text of Ichneutai as a voice specialist. And then 2 years as Michail Marmarinos' consultant in the production I will be talking about in rehearsals. And then a year and a half of research, turmoil, rethinking what I've discovered in the text. So because of that, I would love to start with my thanks, like Paul did. My thanks over 5 years are so heavy and numerous that I will bore you to death if I start with those. But for today, I would like to just single out the organizing committee of the event, the archive, and Fiona McIntosh for the generous invitation. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for having me. The title, yes, is voiced in Unacoustics in Sophocles is, I will call this Ichneutai. And I want to be talking about this play, which is Tracheas by Sophocles. And as you might have guessed from the title, this is a voice studies lecture. We'll be talking a lot about voice and reception of voice and voice theory. So let us begin. It is July 2021, and the first modern production of Sophocles' Ichneutai in the ancient theatre of Epidores, directed by Michail Marmarinos, is unfolding. For about 20 minutes, the audience have been watching a chorus of satyrs scouring the ground for traces of Apollo's missing herd. They have been sniffing and tracking with acrobatic plasticity, yelling at each other for encouragement, panting laboriously, and all of a sudden, an ethereal voice hovers above. It is the voice of Steve Katona, a countertenor situated at the very top tier behind the audience. Gently underscored, you cannot hear it now, by composition by the Billy Bulthill, the composer of the production. So when entering the theatre, the spectators would have noticed the unusual placement of 4 brass instrumentalists around the auditorium, but they wouldn't have noticed Katona because he was behind the audience, hiding. The sound of his voice, the moment it occurs, incurs in the space what I call sort of scenographic and audiovisual rapture. We have heard all the satyrs hearkening near the ground and talking about a vibration emanating from underneath the earth, from a cave. And suddenly, we hear them responding to a sound that comes behind us, and it's a human voice. So this sound is surprising for the audience as well, but more so for the characters, the satyrs. They're terrified, they're literally, as you've seen, stopped in their tracks. And then the leader, Silenus, tells them, I didn't hear any sound, starts scolding them and asks them to start searching again for the herd of Apollo. And they start searching again, and then for a second time we get to hear the voice of Steve Katona once again, and that voice leaves them even more terrified and even more perplexed. Why? Because as spectators will come to understand, in their narrative world, this voice, this sound, is something they have never heard before. Music, and more specifically, instrumental music. So let's talk a little bit about Ichneutai. Ichneutai, as some of you might know, is a 5th century BCE satyr play by Sophocles, which survives as a longish fragment. It has been reconstructed a little bit so that we can perform it, and it is inspired by the story of how newborn god Hermes stole Apollo's cattle. And then the play stages for us the mythological invention of the first musical instrument, the lyre. The play begins with Apollo in the production performed by Haris Frangoulis, entering the space a little bit disheveled, in distress, and asks for help. Somebody stole his cattle, and he's asking for help. And then he outsources the research to Silenus, the leader of the satyrs, in the production performed by Stamatis Kraonakis, who calls upon his satyrs to come and help. So the satyrs have, as we've seen, tracked the cattle's footprints in all sorts of comedic manner. They encounter the sound, they are terrified by it, so what do they decide to do because they're so scared? They say, we're going to start stomping and kicking the earth so that the person who's making that sound will come above and we can see them. They start doing that, it's a moment of pandemonium. Who comes out is not Hermes, is nymph Kylene. Silene, I will call her Kylene so that you don't get confused between Silenus and Silene. Okay, this is nymph Kylene, the nymph of the mountain performed by Amalia Mutusi. She comes out and she explains to the satyrs the source of the sound, that it is the infant Hermes, and then explains to them how he constructed the very first instrument, the lyre, out of a dead body of a tortoise, out of the shell, and cattle skin. And of course, the satyrs, as soon as they hear a mention of cattle skin, they say, we found the thief. So they call upon Apollo, they say, oh, your cattle are here. And Apollo arrives again, and this is a scene that we don't have in the fragment. It's reconstructed in the production. This is based on the reconstruction by German philologist Karl Lorenz. Apollo comes back, and Apollo himself, again, is so enchanted by the new instrument, by the lyre, that agrees to give up his cattle to Hermes in exchange of the instrument. Therefore, now, at the end of the play, Apollo becoming the god of music, and Hermes becoming the god of heraldry, and the messenger of the gods, etc., and the guide and leader of dead people, as we've already heard. He was a very busy god. So, for me, this is a really important and quite extraordinary play, precisely because it thematizes for us music. Music is the theme. And in the process of staging music for us, it also establishes, perhaps as the first play in the European theatrical canon, on-stage modalities for listening, for receiving music. It shows us how to perceive it, how to listen to it. I consider this play for this reason a sort of originary musico-theatrical scene. And in order to unpack it, I will use a slight paradoxical analytical tool, voice. It's slightly unlikely because in the narrative world of the play, instrumental music is the focus, but I suggest that listening closely to what voice does in the play can reveal to us a lot of what voices do in general, in the theatre, and in ancient performance more specifically. And in order to do this unpacking, I have structured this talk into two sections. The first one is a sort of microscopic close listening of the text, or to elide the visual metaphor, a microphonic listening of the text. I sort of create a sound map of all the terms that speak to sound and voice in the text. It's like a vocal archaeologist scouring the sort of fragmented side of the text and listening out for echoes of its vocal origins. What do these terms say about voice? And then, what I do in the second part of the talk, I take a step back and I do a macrophonic listening and I start asking questions about how do we theorize voice in this production and beyond? What are its political and its ethical implications? In the first part, the logic is not just to do sort of a sound-friendly philology of the text. For me, I'm doing this close listening of the terms because this helped me as an assistant to Marmarinos clarify a lot of the dramaturgical functions of the voice that I think have some sort of relevance beyond this play and this production. And I believe because voice studies is a very nascent discipline, we need terms, we need terminology, and we need to start unpacking voice not just as one singular event, but to start understanding it as a multi-channel event. When we talk about voices, a lot of things are going on, and we need to disentangle and start understanding them. And I'll try to sort of share with you some of these vocal functions through the microphonic listening. So to begin with, to start with the microphonic listening, I want to talk very briefly about three functions of the voice that are very present in this text and in this production, but are sort of so obvious in all sort of voice-based theatre that we don't need really to explain them, but I think it's, as I said, really important to name them. So the first one is voice as an index of performed identity. I go to the theatre, I hear an actor speaking, they say, hello, I'm, I don't know, Hercules, and immediately what I do, I take their voice and I adjust it back, I sort of collide it with the body and I say, oh, this is the actor performing Hercules, or this is Hercules. Voices and bodies do not automatically come together in the theatre. We do this, and we think it's automatic, but basically voices help us, especially across a distance, to index a character to a body. And of course this happens in the play when Apollo comes and says, hey, I'm Apollo and I need your help. Immediately we understand he's Apollo, right? Now the second function of voice in performance and in Ichneutai is voice as the definitional agent of genre. Voices come in all sorts of shapes and forms, styles and techniques. And for example, and when a voice appears in a theatrical space, at the same time, it makes appear the genre within which we'll appreciate it. When I hear an operatic voice, immediately I'm thinking, I'm in opera and I listen to the production in a specific way. When I hear to a voice which is trained in musical theatre, I apperceive it in a specific way. And of course, genres evolve and diversify, so you can have a specific kind of a technique against a specific kind of background that creates a new form of genre. For example, you might have rock opera. But despite this diversification, voices are still the sort of cornerstone of the immutability or unfixity of genre. They invite us to perceive every voice that happens in a space within a specific aesthetic and genealogical context. And of course this happens in this play because we have a chorus of satyrs voicing together, we apperceive this and listen to it as a satyr drama. And finally, and again quite obvious, but we need to name it, voice is a sonic constituent. So when you have a production that has a lot of sonic elements, voice can be one of them, but you might have others. You might have live or pre-recorded music, you might have sound design, you might have solo, collective voices, etc., etc. Or of course, the sounds that the audiences are making. A lot of the time, we might either consider the voice as one element of the oral tapestry of the piece, which is not too dissimilar to others, it's pretty equal to others. So for example, when you have composed theatres like Markthaler and Goebbels, voices are pretty much the same as music and the sound of audience. But most of the time, particularly in voice-based theatre, voices tend to top the hierarchy of sounds. So first we connect to the sound of the voices of the actors, then comes music, then comes sound design, and somewhere down there, the underexplored area of audience sounds, which is called vococentrism. This is what Michel Sion calls it. As human ears, we are adjusted to perceiving voices first. And again, this happens in each play. But to me, analyzing the play and living with it for so long helped me elucidate another 4 functions of the voice that are very rarely talked about or named as such, and I want to bring them forward to our attention. First of all, voice as linguistic anchorage. I'll explain that in a second. So, all characters in the play, in their attempt to confront the newly created sounds of music, they're trying to understand something that's new. And they're trying to describe it. They engage pre-existing lexicons, and all these vocabularies implicate music with voice. Every time they refer to the new sound, they call it a type of voice. So, for example, when they hear the sound for the first time and are terrified and are stopped in the tracks, Silenus does not hear the sound, and they tell him, "Did you hear any phoneme? Did you hear any voice?" Later on, when Selene comes out, and they ask her again what was the sound inside the cave, they ask her what was this phlegma, what is this spoken utterance, what was this spoken voice, what was this speech. So this is pervasive. There are just 2 of the examples in the text. So these views of such terminology in the Sophoclean text implicitly posits voice as a category more familiar or comprehensible in the universe of the satyrs, or even as a category that encompasses what emerges in the dramatic now as music. Music appears as a kind of voice. So we might be hearing music, they might be talking about an instrument, but every character persistently tells us this is a voice. And what that does is very akin to what Roland Barthes has called anchorage. According to Roland Barthes, I'm digressing a little bit to symbolic theory here, when you have images in advertising, you might have a poster with all these different objects, and you might want to derive your own meaning, or here a little bit of colors and this or that object. But when you use text, you superimpose it on the poster and you have a tagline. That text stops the myriad possibilities of interpretation, and it tells you what to see in the image. Right? So it redirects the reader through the signifieds of the image by means of a subtle dispatching, and it remotes control them towards a meaning chosen in advance. And I purport that this voice-rich textuality in the text of Sophocles, the fact that they keep saying voice, 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 does the same to us. Every time we hear a sound, we also hear within it a voice, or we start perceiving it as voice. This is a function of voice in the theatre that we rarely talk about, but it's quite powerful. In fact, it's pervasive, especially in ancient Greek drama, and I've already done it at the beginning of the talk when I started saying Apollo enters the space and I showed you the image of Haris Fragoulis. You might have wanted to say, Haris Fragoulis, or I don't know this actor, or you might have wanted to linger a little bit on the makeup and the costume and the scenography, but at the moment my voice in this space said Apollo, he becomes Apollo. So this is the function of voice's linguistic anchorage. A second thing that voice does in Ichneutai, and again I think is quite pervasive and quite useful to talk about, is voice as a material backdrop to all other sound. So in the piece we have already a lot of voices. We have the monologues and dialogues by the satyrs and the characters. We have a lot of song. Voice is the prevalent sonic material, despite it being a text about music. And there is a rich and varied vocabulary in the text that describes to us the vocal mannerisms and behavior of all characters. Every time a character enters the space, they say something about the voice they heard. So when Apollo shouts out for help and Silenus comes in, he says, "I heard your booming declaration," not your text, your voice booming, vondos kirigmasi. Then, when Silenus asks for help for the satyrs come in and they say, "Oh, Father, we heard your hearing," which is, we heard your passionate voice. And when later the satyrs start hearing the sounds of the cattle in the distance, again they call them phtherma. So what we come to realize is that we live in a universe where voices pre-exist music, and actually voices are the background to the emergence of music. And in the production by Marmarinos, this positing of the voice as prior to music becomes quite literal. I'll play you a short clip from the opening. So in the beginning, Haris Frangoulis, the actor playing Apollo, enters the space. We don't have any musical accompaniment or sound design to say, "Hey, the production begins." He uses just the very first phoneme of the text, "hey," which is, "Hey you, call out for help," and keeps repeating it and repeating it and repeating, "Hey, hey, hey, hey." And the chorus of satyrs are embedded within the landscape and keep repeating it, musicalizing it for us. And therefore this designates to us that we are in a universe where voices, both solo and collective, already exist and perform multiple vocalities, and it's music that it's yet to enter the oral field. And again, in order to understand what Sophocles does here and what Marmarinos does in the production, I'm taking course to composer and sound ecologist Mary Schaefer, a little bit of voice theory. Mary Schaefer has famously told us that all soundscapes that we hear have two fundamental structures. One is the keynote, the fundamental tone. So right now, in this situation, our landscape, our soundscape, has as a keynote the ambience of a classroom, a little bit of the projector, that kind of silence that says, "Oh, somebody's paying attention to somebody else." And then the second structure are foreground sounds, signal sounds that are basically something that sticks out from the background. Right now, in this situation, my voice is a signal. The important thing that Mary Schaefer has elucidated for us is that both of those, the keynote and the foreground sound, they gather their meaning, not individually, but because of their interaction. So in this room, my voice is heard as the voice of a lecturer or as a guest speaker because the ambience tells us we're in a lecture hall. The same speech from the same person somewhere else might have said something else, right? And we do that in the theatre as well. Conventionally, in the theatre, music and sound design are the keynote, the background, and the actors' voices are the foreground. But in Ichneutai, we are asked to reverse our habitus of listening and accept that voices are the background and music will emerge and therefore acquire its meaning as irregular, exceptional sound that we need to deal with. Because we already have voice, but we don't have music. Yes? A third function of the voice that I want to sort of thematize a little bit and name. I call this voice as dramaturgy of listening. This is very close to the first one, vocal anchorage, but vocal anchorage has to do with production. It tells us what the sound is, whereas voice of the dramaturgy of listening tells us how to listen to a voice. So in this piece, all the sort of silences and vocalizations, dialogue encoded in the script mediate to us the experience of listening. They tell us how characters listen and how we should listen to characters listening. So, for example, when Silenus says to the satyrs, "Why have you stopped?" he has T-E-E's. They're making this repeated sound, E, 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 E. They repeat an E, which might be a response to the new sound. They are in awe, they're afraid, or it might be their way of communicating to Silenus what they're hearing. They're trying to interpret it in their voice. So we're invited to listen to Silenus, trying to understand what they are listening, and at the same time, this appellation, this vocalization, establishes for us a sort of double oral consciousness in the piece. We know, as audiences, that in the narrative there are characters that can hear the sound and characters that can't. And this dramaturgs our reception of the piece. Now, there is an exquisite moment of that in the piece, where Silene, the nymph, does this for us. By the by, these pictures obviously are not from Epidaurus. The piece was performed for the second time after Epidaurus at Mount Xiria, Mount Silene, just outside the cave of Hermes. It was a big event, it was site-specific, thousands of people traveled. I wanted to show you clips of that, but of course Michail has been editing and fixing this video for about 3 years. I spoke to Michail last week and he said the video is going to be ready next week. Bad timing, so we might organize a screening or something. This was actually a very interesting production as well because of the tautology of saying, "I am here at the top of Mount Silene and I call for your help," and Apollo being on the top of Mount Silene. All right? Now I want to return a little bit to Kilini and what she does. Kilini dramaturgs our listening in a fantastic way in what we would call in contemporary terms musical appreciation class or music theory class. The satyrs ask her, "What is this sound?" And she says, "Okay, listen how Hermes started inventing the sound. First, he started plucking individual tones, he calls them toni, individual notes. Then he started experimenting with melos xymphonon, harmonious melody, and finally with eolisma, which is ornamentation. In very contemporary terms, we have a lesson in music theory. She says to us, you might want to respond to this sound in any way you feel like to. You might feel a certain emotion to this music, but she says, no, listen to me, I'm sort of a musicologist and you need to hear tones, melody, perhaps harmony, ornamentation. This is what I want you to listen to. And in the process, dramaturgs our attention. She teaches the audience of how to be people that appreciate good music. And in order to understand the importance of that, here is acousmatic voice, okay, that has already been mentioned. This happens because the sound of Hermes' lyre and the sound of Caton at the top of the auditorium is acousmatic. It doesn't have a visible source. And when, as humans, we want for a voice to be attached to a body, according to a lot of theories of acousmaticity, when we hear a voice and we cannot see the source, we have a sort of ontological anxiety. We don't know what's happening. We assign omniscience and omnipotence to that voice. We don't know how to react to it. And according to Michel Sion, film theorist of the voice, when we have to deal with an acousmatic voice, we engage in 3 different ways, modalities of listening in hierarchical order. First of all, causal listening. We're asking, where is the source? Who is the source? We want to identify the person making the sound. And then the second thing we do is semantic or codal listening. We listen to what they have to say. It can be text, or it can be an emotion. Are they in distress? Are they calling out for help? And the final thing we might do, according to Sion, he says it's quite rare, is reduced listening. Just appreciate the sound for what it is, not where it's coming from or what it conveys. So, for example, in the theatre, we do this in the same hierarchical order. When we go to the theatre and we hear somebody speaking, first of all, we're like, oh, this voice belongs to that body. Check. Causal listening. What are they saying? Oh, so this character wants me to believe this or that. Semantic listening. Very rarely we bring our attention to the sound in itself. So, for example, you might go, oh, the body mic is a little bit off, there is a problem. Oh, that actor sounds a little bit tired. Oh, what a lovely voice. But we don't do that very often in the theatre. Again, I suggest that in the play, the way voice is used in the text reverses our habitus of listening, because it emphatically proposes that first and foremost we need to do reduced listening. We need to say, what are the qualities of the sound? How do we respond to an unknown sound? And then semantic listening, what does it say? And finally, at the very end, the satyrs decide to sort of trace the source and they start stomping the ground. So it's another reversal of expectations there. And finally, I know you have been following the obsessive micro-listening of a voice study scholar. Welcome to my height when I'm in a performance, hearing all that in a singular voice. To me, this is one of the most important functions of voice in the theatre, and we very rarely talk about that. It's what I call voice as a catalyst or an instigator of a vocal imaginary. When I work with students in the studio, and they make a vocal or music or sound piece, or when I work with students that I have to present something the same around a vocal event, be it cultural or aesthetic or everyday, I ask them, yes, you're talking about voice or you're creating these voices, but what sort of vocal imaginary are they making appear in the minds of the audience? So, for example, if we have the Odyssey, the famous passage of the sirens, that imaginary, if you have to analyze it, it involves certain elements. It has certain rules. It has a specific, extent of the reach of the voice. Hybrid creatures like the sirens can sing. These voices in that universe, in that imaginary, can exert enchantment and fatal attraction, and they can have consequences. These are the rules. This is the guidebook for the siren scene. And I purport that in every vocal utterance in the theatre, we bring forth an imaginary, we make the audiences believe that the rules by which the way we use the voice in the text are the genuine rules we should follow. And in order to go back to Ichneutai and finish the micro-listening, I have asked, what is the vocal imaginary brought forth by all these voice texts in Ichneutai? And the first answer I have to give is this is a non-anthropocentric, a more than human vocal imaginary. No voice that we get to hear in the performance comes from a human. All people voicing on stage are gods, nymphs, and the half-hybrid, half-animal creatures that are the satyrs. And all these creatures, they operate within a more than human sonic field where they understand everything as having a voice, and none of these voices is bigger than or louder than or more important than the others. Everything has a voice, and they're equal voices. So, for example, when they ask Celine again and again and again and again, what is the sound that comes out from your cave and resonates around the landscape, they ask her, what is this omphi? And omphi is God's voice, later on used as oracle, omphalos, etc., etc. So gods have voices, the landscape has a voice, and they're pretty much equal. And when she tells them that the dead animal, the tortoiseshell, now is singing, they are befuddled. The animals have a voice, and they ask her, so an animal that didn't have a voice while alive, how can it have a voice while dead? So, in this vocal imaginary, in this vocal universe, voice is everywhere, does not belong to humans. We are in a sort of pre-anthropomusical moment, before human-made music, where voice is a centripetal force that brings together all the pre-anthropomusical acoustics in non-hierarchic and fluid ways of connecting to each other in a very symbiotic way. And voice signifies, to use Donna Haraway's term, acoustic sympoiesis, a way of living and being together. And what is at stake against this vocal imaginary is the emergence of a new sound, that of music, that is made, the verb used in the text is emichanisa, to somebody machinated that sound, right? Which threatens or even endangers this non-hierarchical or fluid vocal imaginary because it wants to claim the hierarchy for itself. So, thank you very much for engaging in the micro-listening. I know it's been very obsessive. Now I'm going to take a step back, metaphorical step back, and I'm going to go into the macrophonic listening and start asking wider questions about the production and the piece. And the first question to ask is, why does Ichneutai as a play use all these vocal strategies? It was very useful analytically because it clarified them for us. But why does it use voice as a backdrop, conceptual and material, as vocal anchorage, as dramaturgy in the perception, as vocal imaginary? Why? And the answer is because of its dramaturgy. Because in this play, we have somehow to stage something that we have never heard before. We have to deal with acoustic impossibility. So all these voices are synergistically enlisted so that we can talk, designate, dramaturg the perception of people and make them believe that this, what you're hearing, is a new sound. It's a sound different from what you're experienced in. And I have called that an unacoustic sound. I think unacoustics is very emphatically the dramaturgy of Ichneutai, but the way my mind goes for the last year, I think it's a wider area of research, and I can explain why. Now, the word unacoustic comes from the Greek privative prefix an, which denotes absence or lack or want or need or opposition, and acoustikos, which is related to hearing or the ability to hear. Unacoustics, the opposite of what we hear or what we can hear. So this area sets out to investigate what is the opposite of that which can be heard, and very crucially for me, that which is rendered as impossible to hear. Because a lot of the time, you might hear a new sound, all right, this falls into the first three categories of the unacoustic, that you haven't heard before, but a lot of the time, we have sounds that we hear, but we want to pretend they are not there, that they are not normative sounds, and we posit them as unacoustic sounds that we shouldn't hear frequently, or it's the first time that I'm hearing this sound, and suffice to sort of remind you of colonialist attitudes towards indigenous song, misogynist attitudes towards women's voices. Why did Marilyn have to talk like this, or Jackie O? Because the misogynist male ear wanted them to sound like that. Transphobic perspectives of voice, etc., that render, or racist perspectives on voice, render these voices unacoustic, despite their production. So for me, the unacoustic is a sort of new subfield of research which intersects with voice and music and sound studies and asks us, and I'm inviting you all to start examining in practice and in theory, all these implausible, imperceptible, inconceivable, inaccessible, unimaginable, even unattainable sounds, all these sounds which are situated or placed beyond oral possibility. We are told they are not possible. And of course the term might be new, and I'm obsessing about all these different possibilities of how to research all these sounds, and I purport that this applies to a lot of other plays in the repertoire of antiquity. I'm very familiar with a lot of Sophoclean plays because I've been involved as an artist in their making, and I think the entire dramaturgy of Electra, or Ajax, is around that, is around the unacoustic laughter against the hero, or the unacoustic vocal mannerisms of a woman shouting at the door. But we'll talk about that if you want in the discussion. However, the term might be new. I don't think dealing with the unacoustic is very new, because already at the time of Sophocles, the question of how do I stage a sound that nobody has heard before was prevalent for the production. They had to find a way. And again, this necessitated some form of novelty already in antiquity. First of all, let me remind you that we're in a satyr play, so the predominant instrument, the default instrument is the aulus, the reed, a wind instrument. So if you have to stage a play where everybody listens to a lyre, you're faced with a few options as a theatre maker. The first option is you forego the traditional conventional instrument and you use a tortoise-shell lyre. So when everybody talks about the lyre, you hear a lyre. This is sort of denotation. The second option, which I feel is the most likely, is that you don't use the lyre, but you use the kithara, which is a more advanced string instrument. It's wooden, and it's made for aesthetic appreciation. It's made for public competitions, etc., etc. So it's a little bit better in the aesthetic imagination than this, which is considered an instrument for education for beginners, and this is a little bit more complex. And also we know, as Timothy Power has reminded us as well recently, he's written a lot of articles around that, that Sophocles himself was somebody who was an accomplished guitar player. So he might have chosen his own instrument to be heard in the production. Now there is a third option, which is quite unlikely, because I don't know if I want, the ancient Greeks to have done this meta, but I'm not sure they did. So the option is, because we're in a satyr playing, and tradition demands that we hear the aulos, we stick to the aulos, and we hear a wind instrument, but everybody else says, "Do you hear a lyre?" So it's very meta-theatrical, very playful, or to use Naomi Weiss's term, it's very meta-musical. It's a comment on the music that we hear. Now, I hope this is not fully recorded, it's going to be edited. There is a fourth option in my mind, which has to do with cultural context, but this is so unlike, this is just a director's imagination running wild. We know that at the time that the play was performed, we had all these big building projects in the Acropolis. So in my mind, I was thinking, everybody curses the urban soundscape, do. But we know that in the big celebrations, Dionysian Panathenia, building stopped. Wouldn't it be amazing to have complete silence? And everybody goes, "That's a new sound." But please don't quote me, this is just my imagination going away. So, already we see how the Unacoustic was staged, alongside all the functions of the voice that I have already outlined, rendering any music we hear on stage, any instrument, synonymous, analogous, or at least co-constitutive with voice. To return to Michail Marmarinos' production, let us hear a little bit. This is the last closing scene, when Apollo hears the music for the first time himself. He has returned, he's been summoned by the satyrs. He hears Hermes, and he's also sort of enchanted, seduced by the music. So, what Marmarinos does, which I found very, very cynically, theatrically clever, is in a play that consistently tells us every sound of music we hear is voice, he made that sound literally a voice. So whenever we hear the sound of the lyre, we hear the countertenor voice in the first times that the satyrs get terrified, and in this closing scene, when Hermes emerges from the cave, meets his god brother Apollo, and decides to give him his instrument, he starts descending from the top of the auditorium and sings among the audience in full operatic splendor, making his voice really present, really resonant. As you can see, he doesn't hold the lyre, he has a big cattle skin, that's what's at stake in the play, who took the cattle, and a drawing of the lyre, we never get to see it, and this action of banging it on the ground is his music-making action. So essentially, Katona's voice, for me, becomes a proxy and a surrogate for the freshly invented music, a sort of sonic doppelganger which alludes to the oral fluidity of the text and which sabotages any convention and any expectation we might have in the theatre that only instrumental music stands in for itself. That if the text says an instrument plays, you need to have an instrument playing. You can have voice. I want to pay a little bit of closer attention to the actual material, phenomenal voice that we have there. Who are you? You look like a thief. Phoebus, this is hubris, calling me a thief. So as you might have heard, Katonas' voice is multiply unconventional and pretty exciting to me. First of all, because we're in a text-driven production, there's no other sort of, in the choruses they never sing. And you have one single and singular operatic voice against this background. And even in the dialogic scene, I just played a little bit of a clip, the voice, what it does, it performs an exhaustively rehearsed speech song. It oscillates between singing and over-articulated speech. It never resolves itself into speech. It still stays emphatically an operatic voice. The second thing I want to say about this material voice is that because it's an operatic voice, it's quite unsurprising to me that in a lot of the reviews, a myth attached to the operatic voice crops up again and again and again. For example, Stella Harami in her review says that Katonas's body voice is an androgynous one. How many times have we heard that an operatic voice, and particularly a countertenor's voice, is neither male or female, it's both male and female, it's androgynous just because. And for me this is important because as musicologist Freya Jarman has reminded us, voice is not just an expression of our gender, it is a technology of our gender. We use voice not only to express what our supposed gender is, but in order to perform and reproduce the sonic contours of our gender because of the cultural ear. The culture around me expects me to sound out my gender in specific ways, therefore I'm sounding it. And of course, as Freya Jarman again has reminded us, we have queer voices that have the potential to activate slippages between what the culture expects and what body voices do. And to me, this voice of an openly queer artist, which is also a queering voice in its usage, activates many slippages in the production. And a final marker of this voice are you willing to gift me the instrument forever? Apollo asks. Anchorage. Take the cattle. So Hermes will think a little bit about that. I played a little bit of Frangoulis' voice because none of the other voices in the space are accented. They are voices of native speakers. Steve Katseva is a non-native speaker, audibly non-native. He's trained in the languages of the operatic canon, so in his voice we can hear a little bit of German and Italian and French and English. And this is particularly important because we are at the National Festival in Epidaurus, where voices of foreigners have not been particularly welcomed by a bunch of critics that purport to preserve for us a mono-ethnic, supposedly pan-regional version of the Greek accent. There's one way of speaking Greek. And of course, as Sabatakakis has shown, the Festival of Epidaurus is considered as a preservation of a sacred national heritage. So that voice, within this theatre and within this context, is perceived as lesser than. So on the one hand, it's a voice because it's operatic and it has sort of the most difficult and best, supposedly, technique against text. And because it signifies to us the new sound of music, it's sublimated. And on the other hand, it's a voice that is considered very particularly marked because of its gender reception and because of its cultural acoustics. So this voice, it's not just an atypical signifier signifying music, it's also a paradoxical, idiosyncratic voice on the material plane as well. And it's, I would say, joyfully unassimilable. Within and against its given aesthetic context, it is itself an unacoustic vocality for Epidaurus, performing musical unacoustics. And to conclude my blabbering on about voices, I want to take one step further back and ask, all is well, we have now a theory, we have terms, we micro-listened to the text, but why do all that? What are the politics, what are the ethics of it? And for me, the answer lies in the closing scene of the production. What happens in Marmarinos' production is when Frangoulis takes the lyre from Hermes, takes the instrument, he repeatedly imitates his actions. He sort of throws this to the ground and tries to make a sound, and he cannot make a sound. And after about 5 minutes is a long scenic time, he keeps banging and banging and banging, and there's dust. And one of the chorus characters comes out to the audience and says, in sort of Parabasis way, "This text is a fragment. We are missing text here." Which I thought was clever enough by Israel. So when Frangoulis finally achieves a sound, his voice sounds something like that. Let me play this quickly. I found it! Phoebos is playing music. So his voice is low, rumbly, repetitious, unlike Hermes' voice. And the other thing that happens is that the moment he starts singing, I don't know if you noticed, the four instrumentalists that were placed amidst the audience come down to the stage. Up to there they were playing experimental music, etc. Now they sort of resolve themselves into a familiar musical structure, bum, 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 a continuum that carries on playing. They stand to the sides of the stage and then they exit and they play music from the sides, the pit, as it were, the conventional scenography. When we have music, we make the musicians disappear. And what happens at that moment is Apollo, now, the visible metaphor for music, he's singing, takes Hermes by the hand and they sort of backtrack, they go out of the space and they decide to head to Olympus to instate Apollo as the god of music. And this is how the production ends. So I want to highlight how, unlike Hermes' miraculous invention of music, Apollo's music belongs to effort, to repetition, to labor. And unlike Catona's adventurous, queering, marked speech song, when it's transferred to Frangoulis' voice, we have a just, resonant, low, rumbling, recognizably male voice of a very famous protagonist in Greece, who's very trained in theatrical speech, but audibly not in music. He's not a singer. So what happens is we have multiple shifts in that moment. We had the unacoustic, Hermes, now we have the acoustic, the music that we see and hear. We had the acousmatic, non-visible source, and we have the visible source, the musicians and Apollo. We had voice posited as music, now we get music as well. We had a queering voice, we have a very normative voice. We have a voice posited as otherworldly to a voice posited as familiar within Epidorus. And to me, all these shifts are a comment about the transference of power and the imbrication of music within power structure. And why do I say that? While at the beginning of the story, music, as I said, was everywhere as voice, now it is indexed in specific bodies and it's allocated designated spaces. Mount Olympus in the narrative and the sides of the stage in the staging of the piece. While in the first half of the production music invoked wonder and mystery, now it belongs to repetition, education and craft. Music now might be endowed with a patron god, but this brings forward its institutionalization as well. You might have a god, but now you need to take music outside of Selene and the environment, the landscape, and seek official approval from the gods. And this sort of shift of what I call an ecology of voice to an economy, very shoehorned economy of music, leaves Marmarinos' satyrs puzzled, perplexed. This is the very closing scene. Normally in a satyr play, you get all this dancing and singing, Sikinis, the dance of the satyrs, which is a celebration of concluding the feat. We won the gold! Yay! It's a set, they are motionless. For the first time we don't hear anything coming out from the body mics. All music has exited the stage. They feel very, withdrawn and whispery. And I think this is because these satyrs used to occupy a world filled with voices, but are now watching as music becomes codified, is assigned a standardized place in space, and gets literally extracted from its original landscape to seek divine edges. For me, this is a theatrical moment that resonates deeply with anti-colonialist perspectives on music. For example, scholar, First Nations scholar in Canada, Dylan Robinson, has criticized what he calls the colonizers' hungry listening. When Europeans came, what they did with First Nations song and music was they extracted it for a sort of ethnomusicological project to categorize it, or to supposedly elevate it in their own aesthetic pieces of music because it wasn't worthy, supposedly in and of itself, without any sense of care about its context, about its situatedness, about its functions in the community. And I think this is something similar happening here. These satyrs come to realize that they accidentally entered a sound territory as guests and are now watching as the new god removes the voice of new music from its temporalities of wonder, to use Dylan Robinson's wonderful term, fixing it in a non-situated position of certainty. After witnessing the genesis of music firsthand as voice, after the profound experience of vocal unacoustics, their static melancholy and withdrawn voices, for me, pose pressing questions to its European theatre audiences. Is this the theatre sound we want? Is this what music was invented for? Is this the only voice that gets to be heard after all? Thank you very much.